Hi, this is UC Light from New Growth Counseling Services in Carlsbad, and today I want to talk about healing from affairs. Affairs are extraordinarily difficult to heal from because there's a betrayal involved. And as we all know, long-term committed relationships really depend upon the trust. I've talked about in other videos that when you make a special relationship with a person that's based in love, it's as though you give a piece of your heart to them and they give a piece of theirs back to you, and you each hold and tend to that piece. And a betrayal, like an affair, is like taking that piece of the heart and, throwing it away or squashing it. And so people ask all the time, how do we heal from an affair? And I'm going to try to deal with that today. It's a very lengthy topic, but I'm going to condense it down to about 10 or 15 minutes. One of the big things that's hard about an affair is that you have two people that are on two different timelines. There's the person who's been carrying on the affair. They're the ones that's doing the injuring. And they know they've been doing this for a while. Unless it's an emotional affair and they're not realizing that they're doing this. But most of the people who are involved in an affair, they realize they are hiding something, they are keeping something. And so they've actually known about this situation for quite some time. The other person does not. And so when the affair comes out, and that can be that someone discloses it or somebody finds out or someone gets caught, the person who finds out, the injured party, is shocked. They are just finding out about this, and the person who's been involved in the affair has known about it for some time, so they're not at all in the same place, and it's coming at a time where they really need to be in the same place. So I'm going to talk about this from two different places moving forward. First, I'm going to talk about what it's like being the injured party, and then I'm going to talk about what it's like being the injuring party. So starting with the party, the person that's feeling betrayed, they are injured, they find out, and one of the first things that they need is they need safety. And so in counseling, one of the first things we do is we start to talk about the emotional lack of safety that an affair reveals. The person who is injured suddenly finds themselves with this new information. It could be that maybe there was an emotional connection to another person. It could have been that there was a sexual connection, or it could have been that there was a full-on romance and falling in love with another person. So the person who's injured is finding this out, and depending on what they find out affects them deeply. And it can require safety, especially when you have, a marriage with children and a home and cars and finances. There's a way that the person is they're confronted with the choice of whether I even want to stay. And so typically what we see is that there's a need for structure. How do I know that this affair is over? Is there a way I can prove it? Can I have access to your emails and your passwords and go on your Facebook? So this is a great question. And a lot of times in therapy, what we wind up doing is sitting with the couple, and we privilege, at the early stages for sure, we privilege the person who's been injured and seek to understand what they need to at least feel safe and create a structure of accountability that at least it helps this person realize the extent of the damage. And that takes us to our second point. There's a deep, deep need for understanding, which usually involves full disclosure. What exactly was this affair? How long did it go on? How deep was it? Were there emotions? Was it a one-night stand, etc.? So it's very, very important for the person who's been injured to begin to understand what they're dealing with. And we get into the topic of full disclosure. I will speak about that in a moment when I get to the injuring party, because what exactly is full disclosure? How much do I need to know? How much, if I know it, actually damages things even more? The third thing that happens for the person who's been injured is they need an attitude from the person who has injured them. And that attitude can be characterized as sort of a permanent state of apology, where there's an understanding that I am sorry, I feel badly, and I care about you. The person who's been injured needs that kind of attitude humbleness, contriteness, something from the person who's injured them. If they don't receive that, it can be further damaging. So it's very important when we're trying to heal from an affair that the person who's been injured can speak about what they need in terms of an attitude from the other person and possibly an apology. But the one thing for sure that people who have been injured this way don't need is they don't need the pressure to be put on them to forgive and move forward. Remember, the person who's been doing the affair has known about it for a long time. The person who's just finding out about it has to go through the stages of grief. And that's the fourth piece, is the need to grieve, to come to terms with the complexity of what this means, to deal with the shock, the anger, the many, many feelings that tear a person apart inside. Possibly the bargaining phase. I've seen many people who've been injured by affairs try to give the injuring party things to, almost like they're competing with the affair. They do things to try to satisfy or keep or make happy the person who's injured them. In a way, that's kind of like the bargaining phase of grief. And so the person who is grieving has to go through all the stages, and the stage that leads to despair and despondency and depression is the hardest. And of course, they have to come to a place of acceptance that this happened. And how do I make sense out of who my partner is or what this says about my partner or our relationship? This is all part of their grieving, and they need space and they need time. And sometimes they even need their own individual therapy to work through. Often, question of, do I want to stay, comes up. And so when we're talking about the person who's being injured, these are 4 really important things to appreciate: their need for safety and accountability, their need for understanding and full disclosure of what the affair was, their need for an attitude of apology, regret, and understanding, but not pressure to get over it, and their need to grieve. Those are the pieces that they need to go through, and it takes time. When we start to talk about the person who's done the injuring in an affair, that person has needs too. Now, the person who's been injured is not going to be able to listen to those needs. They're dealing with shock, and rightfully so. They need to be privileged. So the person who has done the injuring has to eat crow, as they say, and they have to be patient, and it's very challenging because sometimes there's relief that they feel. The person who's done the injuring, they've been hiding something maybe, and finally it's out and they feel a sense of relief. The other person is not experiencing this, and so the injuring party, they're going to be alone. There's this issue of how much to disclose, because it's very common for the injured person to say what happened, what's the extent, and to also not trust and believe when you're giving your response, because after all, you've been deceiving or lying. Well, there's the whole question of how much do I share? If there was a sexual relationship, what details are given? This is an area that's very controversial, because there needs to be a certain amount of detail that the injured person can come to appreciate what they're dealing with. But too much detail can injure further. And some people push for too much detail, and it's tricky. So working with a therapist around what to disclose is often a very important piece of the puzzle. The person who's done the injuring is also dealing with shame and guilt, most likely, and how to deal with that in a relationship. Normally, when we feel bad about ourselves, we want to go and say, hey, I'm really sorry I've done this, and then have the other person restore us. Or if we're feeling really badly about ourselves because of what it reveals about us, we might even seek comfort from our spouse to reassure us that we're good. Well, if you've been cheating on someone, you're not going to get that, at least not right away. And if you do, that's a concerning situation. Mostly we don't. Mostly if we've been the one who's done the injury, we have to be alone with our guilt and our shame. And it's very important to recognize that we need support. But our partner may feel like they don't trust us, and so maybe part of the reason we were having an affair was that we were seeking support outside the marriage. And so it can be very difficult for the person who's done the injuring to find a way back into the relationship where they're trying to strike the right attitude, but also needing some support because they have regrets, they have shame, and they have guilt. Another thing they can have, though, is they can have anger and they can be upset. And the disclosure of the affair can be very shocking for them, especially if they've been caught. And so they might become defensive and they may lie and they may do things to protect themselves. This is understandable to a degree, but it also causes much, much more injury. The best thing to do is to come clean. Unless, of course, you're not planning to stay in the relationship. And then the best thing to do is to reveal that, which will devastate the other person. But if you were having an affair because the relationship was over, I think the question that I would have for you is, was this the way you wanted to go about ending the relationship? If so, why not disclose it earlier and simply say, I want to part ways and be with another person? It's a hard question to have to deal with. Assuming, though, that the person who had the affair was either deceiving themselves or got caught in temptation or has some kind of a problem that this affair is revealing, there is an incredible often desire to repair things and a struggle to be patient, a struggle to be understanding towards the person that you've injured. Sometimes when we've done this kind of a behavior, we sort of wake up and we see ourselves and go, oh my God, what have I done? And we can become very reactive and swing back and try to be accommodating and loving, but we may also be pushing to be restored, and we can't. We have to be patient, we have to be understanding, and we have to sort of do our time in our own self-reflection to understand, how did I get to this place where I went about dealing with whatever problem I had or whatever relationship dynamic existed, that I wound up dealing with it by having an affair. That can be a very difficult process. And it can also feel difficult when there's pressure to do that. Like you have to do it under threat, or you have to do it because you're being shamed, like what's wrong with you? But I promise you, if you're going to heal from an affair, you have to figure out, how did I get to this place? And it can't just be simply that the other person was so difficult that I kind of did this because they wouldn't provide something. That can be where we start. But cheating belongs to the one who cheats. If you're at a place where you don't want to be in a relationship, then that's the conversation, not going and having an affair, right? Or if you're not getting something out of a relationship, having that conversation is the thing to do, not having an affair. Some people have. Some people have tried to say, I'm not getting this in the relationship and I need this, and they've been met with resistance or some kind of a negativity, and so they feel justified in their affair. When that happens, sometimes the relationship's over. But if there is a desire to continue the relationship on both parts, really the question is, how did it get to this place that I did this? And that's going to come up as part of the healing process. Another really hard thing for the person who's done the injuring is understanding and trying to be supportive of the injured person's grief. The injured person's grief can shift from anger to sorrow, to numbness, back to anger, to distancing and withdrawal, to pursuit, to sexual advances, back to anger. It can really feel discombobulating, but you have to understand that that's part of the grief process. Anybody who's struggling with that can really use some support in couples counseling, because couples therapists who work with affairs, such as those of us at New Growth Counseling do, we understand the balance of trying to frame a person's seemingly erratic shifts as a normal grief response that has to be supported. And what's hard is when you try to support them and then they push you back because you hurt them. There's a way in which healing from affair involves a tremendous amount of growth on the part of the person who injured, because they have to deal with and accept with patience these aspects of their partner who they've injured. So the person who's done the injuring has some relief at the outset, possibly. They have a struggle deciding how much to disclose. They have shame and guilt that they can't get comfort from. They have a struggle to be patient and understanding, and they have to learn how to tolerate the grief of the person that they've injured while they reflect and try to understand, how did it get to this place where I've done this, where I've made this terrible mistake? I've talked about what the person is going through who's been injured, And I've talked about what the person who's going through that did the injury. Now we're going to talk about what to do in the couples work. So there are steps to the healing process in couples work, and you can think about them as maybe 5 or 6 steps. The first step that occurs in couples healing from an affair is that the person who's been injured, they have to go first, and they have to be able to express their injury in a way that comes from the heart and of the soul that is vulnerable. Remember, I've talked about when you're in a relationship, you give a piece of your heart to somebody and they give a piece to you, and you hold and cherish that part. Well, the person who has been injured is sort of taking that piece back and going, look what you've done to this. At the outset, it's often through anger, and sometimes people can be shaming. The person who is injured can be shaming of the person who did the injury. These are understandable and kind of preliminary responses, but in couples therapy, we encourage that person to go far deeper, to go underneath all that anger and hostility down to that vulnerable place of, look what you did to my heart, look how this affected me. And the idea there is that we're trying to help the injured party remember some piece of that heart that was given to them to hold. So the first major step is moving out of anger and shame and towards kind of a vulnerable hurt sharing on the part of the injured person. And that often requires a lot of support because they don't feel safe to do it. And so we understand that that first step requires safety to be in place. The intention to heal is known. There's been a disclosure. We know what we're dealing with. And the grief process has begun. And when we get to that kind of core despair, it's at the bottom of all grief. It's a vulnerable sharing. If we can do that, we've achieved the first step in healing from an affair as a couple. The second step goes right with that. It's like the yang to the yin, okay? There's been a disclosure of vulnerability. The person who's done the injury receives that, and they receive it with an open heart, and they open themselves to the injury of the other, and they are impacted by the hurt of the other. Now, that's an extraordinarily important point to emphasize, because so often the person feels bad for themselves. I feel bad about myself. And that's not what's needed. It's natural, it comes out, and a couples therapist will work with it. But what we're really trying to do is we're trying to get the injuring party to care for the vulnerability of the injured person. So if the injured person says, it crushed me, the injuring person can cry for them. Not for themselves, but for the person they hurt. And when that can happen, it's kind of like mutual vulnerability has been accessed. And what it does is it brings out the caring that's inside the injuring person. They get in touch with the care that they have for the person that they hurt. And the person over here who was hurt feels it. And the connection is restored for a moment. That's extremely important. And a lot of people stop after they've done that. But this isn't going to heal from an affair, okay? Because what naturally happens now is that the injured person realizes, my God, you still care about me. And they're going to deal with some cognitive dissonance of, I can feel that you care for me. So how on earth could you have done this affair? It forces them now to integrate, like, kind of, who are you? If you care for me, how did you do that? And it's a great question. It must be answered. So that moves us into the third part. The third step, I should say, though, is that the injured party actually believes and trusts that the injuring party is authentically feeling care for them. This person who has done the injuring may actually convince the therapist that they care, but the person who's been injured may not be convinced. So the third step that I often place in the process is that the one who was injured starts to become convinced on an emotional level that the other person really does regret hurting them. And then that's where the shift starts to happen. How could you do this? Can sometimes be a shaming statement, like, what's wrong with you? Who does that? But when it becomes a real question, like, how? I can tell you love me. You always loved me and you still love me. So how could you do this? It's a genuine question at that point. That puts the emphasis back on the one who did the injury to really reflect on, well, how could I? And this is where it gets challenging because very often the cause of the affair goes back to something that was maybe missing in the relationship. Now, this can be very challenging for the injured party because in some ways, the injured party and the injuring party were a relationship, and there may have been a dynamic that was unhealthy, or there may be a wound that was old and festering. There could be any number of things that were causing a negative piece in that relationship that was not being addressed, and the affair comes out of that. And so this is when the person who did the injuring starts to reflect, and they may say, I wasn't getting my needs met. I tried talking with you about it. You shut it down. You didn't have time for me. That may actually be part of the issue, and that may be extremely challenging for the person who's been injured to even hear. So this fourth step is very delicate. Other times, though, the person could have a sex addiction where it really has very little to do with this person. It has more to do with the person who did the injury or something else. I mean, there's so many reasons that could go into why there was an injury. But the whole point is that the fourth step involves the injuring person to take serious self-reflection, even away and not in the space of the injured person, to work through their emotions and to reflect on how did I get to this place? And the therapist usually helps with that and tries to take them to a deeper place other than blame. Because if we get stuck here where this person says, I blame you for this affair, it will never heal. And lots of couples come in with that kind of a dynamic. The person who has done the injury has to figure out what this was about for themselves and be able to talk about the relationship. And that then invites a movement into the latter phases of therapy. Because at some point, the injured party can start to say, I couldn't talk to you. I didn't know how to say this. I didn't know how to deal with what was going on between us. And that's why I had the affair. There's some insight where this person takes accountability for what they did, and they're able to share that to the person who they injured in a way that is understandable and has not come out before. It usually reflects something that was missing in this person's side of the equation, and this person can buy it because, like, yeah, you do struggle to talk with me about how you feel or when you don't get your need. You almost never talk about your needs to me. I can see that about you. And so at the fifth step, the injured person is starting to understand, I get why they had the affair. There's actually a good reason for it. It makes sense to me. This is the injured party thinking. But they're thinking about the person who injured them and seeing, yes, I see now. I see it. And there's a mutual kind of an insight. And with this comes a kind of safety creation, because now a statement of never again and commitment to a new way forward can come into the relationship. Sometimes reparations need to come, formal apologies need to come. It sort of depends on what the situation was and who did what to whom and how long it went on until it was discovered and other aspects of the relationship. But sometimes reparations are necessary, where this person says, look, this person over here who's been injured says, look, I see it now, but I have to have your word that you're going to go and get into a full-time recovery for your sex addiction. I need to know that you're committed to that in order for me to really restore this back. And that this person over here goes, yes, I want that. I don't want to be vulnerable to this in the future. And that may not seem like a reparation, but in many, many ways it is, because the person who has done this is reassuring the other person that, I don't want to be in that space again. I don't want to do that and put you in that place. And this person over here accepts it. Sometimes it's a heartfelt apology, though. Sometimes it's like realizing how immature I've been and it's time to grow up. I don't know what it is that causes a person to have an affair until I work with them. But there is a reason. And when the injured party sees that reason and appreciates it and sees that there's a change of heart and mind, then there's usually a restoration of trust, and the relationship can be fully healed at this point. Now, I've said it already in the video, but I want to stress that affairs do reflect something about the relationship. We can't really understand an affair without understanding the relationship that it was born in. Affairs don't just happen willy-nilly, they happen inside of relationships. And so affairs do reveal wounded areas, structural problems. I think of people who maybe are deployed and only see each other 6 months out of a year. Those kinds of structures are not always amenable given people's attachment needs and their longings and desires. So there are lots and lots of reasons for why affairs happen, but they reflect on the marriage in some way, shape, or form. And it's extraordinarily difficult to start there, especially for the person who's been injured. We don't want to start with what this means about the marriage and what was wrong with it, or the relationship and what was wrong with it. That's towards the end of the healing. And so towards the end, we have to deal often with rebuilding or reforming or growing in ways that advance the relationship from the state it was in prior to the affair to a new level that makes it more affair-proof. Again, some people talk about this as 5 or 6 steps. If I talk about it in 6 steps, the wounded party goes first and talks about and shares vulnerably their hurt. The injuring party accepts that and feels negatively and shares that, and then the wounded person experiences it and realizes, you care about me. The first 3 steps. But how could you? Moves us to the 4th step, where the person who did the injury reflects and figures it out and grows and shares that. And the 5th step is that it's received and the person realizes, my gosh, we were vulnerable, or my partner was vulnerable, but now we're getting to this place. And then together they reflect on where the relationship truly was before the affair in the 6th step. And they do things that are necessary to change that relationship. And each person does what they need to do on their side to prevent that cycle from ever getting started again. So there you go. How do we heal from an affair? It is a rather lengthy process. It does involve therapy most of the time. It's really hard to do this on your own. And we certainly want to say to those of you who are watching this, who got something out of this, that if you're suffering, please feel free to reach out to us at New Growth Counseling. We specialize in relationships and repairing and rebuilding trust. And as you can see, it's pretty commonsensical, but often you need a third party to kind of help guide you, because it's very rare for people to be on the same page, because one person knew about this thing and the other person didn't. And when they finally both know about it, no one's in the same space. And so the therapist helps guide you to that 6th step of the repair where everyone's ready finally. It's quite a process, and it's our pleasure to help people who've gone through this. The one thing I can tell you, if you go all the way to the 6 steps, you will be a changed person, and your relationship will as well. And it's part of why the name of our therapy center is New Growth Counseling, because this is the new growth that I speak of. Thanks so much for watching. This has been UC Light from New Growth Counseling Services in Carlsbad, California, and La Jolla. And we encourage you to respond and share this video. We provide this content free of charge to the public in the hopes of raising awareness about mental health. Till next time, take care.